The distant thunder of hooves echoed across the prairie as Frank Turner raced his stallion toward his isolated cabin, the bundle in his arms wailing against the howling Montana wind. His wife had been gone just 3 days, but the baby hadn't stopped crying since they'd lowered Grace's coffin into the unforgiving earth of Riverside's small cemetery. The year was 1876, and the promise of new beginnings that had brought so many westward had twisted into cruel irony for Frank. At 28, he was now a widower with a 2-month-old daughter he had no idea how to care for. "Hush now, Sarah," he whispered, his voice catching as he dismounted and fumbled with the cabin door. "Please, little one." But Sarah only wailed louder, her tiny face flushed crimson against the white blanket. Frank placed her in the wooden cradle he built during Grace's pregnancy, when hope still colored their future. He ran his calloused hands through his sandy hair, exhaustion and grief weighing on his broad shoulders. The cabin felt empty without Grace's laughter. Just 3 days since the fever had taken her, and already the walls seemed to be closing in. Frank sank into a chair by the stove, watching helplessly as his daughter cried. He tried everything, feeding her the goat's milk Mrs. Peterson from town had suggested, checking her swaddling, rocking her until his arms ached, but nothing soothed her. "I don't know what to do," he admitted to the empty room, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do without your mama." A knock at the door startled him. In Riverside, neighbors lived miles apart, and unexpected visitors were rare. Frank opened the door to find a woman standing on his porch, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet. He recognized her vaguely as the new schoolteacher who'd arrived in town last month. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice clear despite the howling wind. "I'm Delia James. I heard about your wife. I brought some food and—" She paused, glancing past him to the crying infant. "Perhaps I could help with the baby?" Frank hesitated. Pride warred with desperation in his chest. "I can manage," he said stiffly, even as Sarah's cries intensified. Delia's green eyes softened. "No one expects you to manage alone, Mr. Turner. Not right away." The sincerity in her voice crumbled his resistance. Frank stepped aside, allowing her into the modest cabin. Delia moved with purpose, setting down her basket and removing her bonnet. Without asking permission, she approached the cradle and lifted Sarah into her arms. "Hello, little one," she murmured, cradling the infant against her shoulder. "What troubles you so?" Frank watched, a mixture of relief and jealousy tightening his chest as Delia walked slowly around the cabin, speaking softly to his daughter. When that didn't quiet Sarah's cries, she began to hum a gentle melody that Frank recognized as "Amazing Grace," a hymn his wife had loved. Delia's voice was clear and sweet, not trained but true. She hummed the melody several times, then began to sing the words softly. Frank felt tears stinging his eyes at the painful irony of the hymn's name, but as Delia continued, Sarah's cries gradually subsided into whimpers, then into the occasional hiccup. "How did you do that?" Frank asked, his voice rough with emotion. Delia smiled, still swaying gently with the now quiet baby. "Music soothes even the most troubled souls, Mr. Turner. And I suspect your daughter misses her mother's voice." The simple truth of her statement struck Frank like a physical blow. Of course Sarah missed Grace. The realization that his daughter was grieving too, in her own way, had never occurred to him. "I don't sing," he said gruffly. "You could learn," Delia suggested, her tone matter-of-fact. "For her." Frank looked away, unable to process the thought. "Why are you here, Miss James? We've barely exchanged 2 words in town." Delia continued to rock Sarah, who was now blinking drowsily against her shoulder. "I know what it is to lose someone suddenly, Mr. Turner. And I know what it is to be left with responsibilities you're not sure you can handle." Her voice softened. "When I heard about your wife, I thought perhaps I could offer some assistance." "I don't need charity," Frank said, stiffening. "It isn't charity to help a neighbor," Delia countered. "Besides, school is not in session for summer break. I have time on my hands." Frank wanted to refuse, to prove he could care for his daughter alone, but Sarah was finally peaceful in this stranger's arms. The thought of facing another night of inconsolable crying made his decision for him. "I could use some help," he admitted, the words difficult to speak. "Just until I get my bearings." Delia nodded, a simple acknowledgement without pity. "I'll come each day for a week. By then you'll have found your way." Frank doubted a week would be enough to piece his shattered life back together, but he didn't argue. Instead, he watched as Delia gently placed the now sleeping Sarah back in her cradle. "I'll make some coffee," he offered, grateful for something to do with his hands. As they sat at his rough-hewn table, steam rising from their cups, Frank studied the schoolteacher. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 23 or 24, with a sprinkling of freckles across her nose and a directness in her gaze that was uncommon in women he'd known. "Where are you from, Miss James?" he asked. "Ohio originally," she replied. "But I've been moving westward for 3 years now." "Alone?" The question slipped out before he could consider its propriety. If Delia was offended, she didn't show it. "My father was a professor. When he died, I decided to use my education to teach in places where teachers were needed." She took a sip of coffee. "The railroad makes it possible for a woman to travel safely these days, at least to the more established territories." Frank nodded, thinking of the changes he'd seen in his own lifetime. The railroad had reached Riverside just 2 years prior, bringing with it an influx of settlers that had transformed the once tiny outpost into a growing town. "And your family? They didn't object to you traveling so far?" A shadow passed over Delia's face. "My mother passed when I was 16. My older brother manages our family home in Ohio, but he has his own family now. We write, of course." She straightened her shoulders. "I've found purpose in teaching. The children here are bright and eager to learn." Frank thought of Grace, who had taught him to read when they were both teenagers. She'd always talked about teaching their children someday. The memory ached. "My wife would have approved of your dedication," he said quietly. Delia met his gaze. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Turner. Truly." The simple sincerity in her voice reached him when the practiced condolences of others had not. For the first time since Grace's death, Frank felt his rigid control slip. He looked away, blinking rapidly. "If you'll excuse me, I should check on the livestock," he said, rising abruptly. Delia didn't try to stop him or offer empty comfort. "I'll stay with Sarah until you return," she said instead. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. Frank leaned against the barn wall, drawing deep breaths of the clean prairie air. He hadn't expected kindness to undo him so completely. Recovering his composure, he completed his chores methodically, finding comfort in the familiar routines. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, he found Delia seated by the fire, mending a tear in one of his shirts. Sarah remained asleep in her cradle. "You don't need to do that," Frank said, nodding toward his shirt. "I don't mind," Delia replied. "Besides, it's nearly finished." Frank hung his hat on a peg by the door. "I should thank you, Miss James, for everything." "Delia, please," she said, knotting her thread and snipping it with small scissors from her pocket. "And you're welcome, Mr. Turner." "Frank," he offered in return. A small smile curved her lips. "Frank, then." As promised, Delia returned the next day, and the next. She arrived mid-morning each day, bringing food, helping with Sarah, and offering practical advice that Frank grudgingly admitted was useful. Under her guidance, he learned to recognize his daughter's different cries: hunger, discomfort, loneliness, and how to respond to each. "She likes the sound of your voice," Delia observed on the 4th day, as Frank spoke quietly to Sarah while changing her diaper. "You should talk to her more." "What would I say to a baby?" Frank asked, bemused. "Anything. Everything," Delia replied. "Tell her about your day, about the ranch, about her mother." Her voice softened. "She needs to know you, Frank." That evening after Delia left, Frank sat in the rocking chair with Sarah on his knee. He felt foolish at first, speaking to an infant who couldn't understand him, but gradually the words began to flow. Your mama loved wildflowers, he told Sarah, whose wide eyes seemed to focus on his face. Every spring, she'd gather buckets of them to brighten this cabin. She was like that, always finding beauty where others might miss it. He swallowed hard. That's how she found me, I suppose? To his surprise, Sarah gurgled in response, her tiny hand reaching toward his face. Frank caught it gently, marveling at the perfect miniature fingers that wrapped around his thumb. You have her eyes, he whispered. Did you know that? Same blue, like the sky after a storm. When Sarah began to fuss as night fell, Frank remembered what Delia had taught him. He began to hum, Amazing Grace, awkwardly, his deep voice untrained but sincere. To his astonishment, Sarah quieted, watching him intently. That night, for the first time since Grace's death, both father and daughter slept peacefully through the night. The next morning, Frank was repairing a fence when he saw Delia approaching on her mare. She looked different today, her hair loose under her hat, wearing a split riding skirt instead of her usual modest dress. I thought we'd do something different, she called as she dismounted. It's a beautiful day, and you and Sarah have been cooped up in that cabin for too long. Frank frowned, glancing toward the house where Sarah was napping. I'm not sure I've packed a picnic, Delia interrupted, patting her saddlebags. And I borrowed Mrs. Peterson's buggy for you and Sarah. She nodded toward the road, where a small buggy waited. There's a lovely spot by the creek that would be perfect. Frank wanted to refuse, to return to the solitude that had become his refuge, but Delia's expression brooked no argument. Reluctantly, he agreed, and soon they were headed toward the creek that wound through his property, Sarah secured in a makeshift sling across his chest. The spot Delia had chosen was indeed beautiful, a grassy clearing shaded by cottonwoods, with the creek burbling nearby. As Frank spread the blanket Delia had brought, he realized he hadn't been here since before Sarah's birth. He and Grace had often picnicked in this very spot during the early years of their marriage. Grace loved this place, he said quietly as Delia unpacked bread, cheese, and preserves from her basket. I thought she might have, Delia replied. It seems like a place where someone would make memories. Frank glanced at her sharply. You're very perceptive, Miss James. A slight blush colored her cheeks. Forgive me if I overstepped. I just thought. Sometimes it helps to remember the joy, not just the loss. Frank settled Sarah on the blanket between them, where she waved her arms excitedly at the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves above. Looking at his daughter's delight, he felt something loosen in his chest. You're right, he admitted. Grace would hate to see me hiding away from life. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the rustling leaves and Sarah's occasional coos. When they'd finished, Delia surprised him by removing her boots and stockings. What are you doing? Frank asked, startled. Cooling my feet in the creek, she replied with a mischievous smile he'd never seen before. It's a warm day, and the water looks inviting. Frank watched, oddly fascinated, as she walked barefoot to the creek and stepped into the shallow water, her skirt hitched modestly to her ankles. Her small feet were pale against the dark stones of the creek bed, and her laugh when the cold water first touched her skin was unexpectedly musical. Join me? She called over her shoulder. I don't think, Frank began. You think too much, Delia interrupted. The water feels wonderful. Before he could stop himself, Frank was removing his boots. He picked up Sarah and carried her to the creek's edge, sitting on a flat rock with her in his lap. He dangled his feet in the cool water, watching as Sarah's eyes widened at this new experience. See? Isn't that better? Delia asked, splashing a little water toward him playfully. Frank found himself smiling, the expression feeling strange on his face after weeks of grief. Yes, he admitted. It is. They stayed by the creek for hours, talking more easily than they had before. Frank found himself sharing stories about Grace, about their journey west from Pennsylvania 7 years earlier, about their dreams for the ranch. Delia listened, asking questions that revealed her genuine interest, occasionally sharing her own experiences of teaching in frontier towns. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the prairie, Frank realized with surprise that he'd enjoyed himself for the first time since Grace's death. The guilt that followed this realization must have shown on his face, because Delia suddenly looked at him with understanding. "It's all right to find moments of happiness again, Frank," she said softly. "It doesn't dishonor her memory." Frank looked down at Sarah, who had fallen asleep against his chest. "I know," he said. "In my head I know that. But my heart—" "Your heart will heal in its own time," Delia said. "No one expects you to rush." As they packed up to return to the cabin, Frank found himself reluctant for the day to end. At the cabin door, he hesitated. "Would you like to stay for supper?" he asked impulsively. "It won't be fancy, but there's plenty." Delia's smile warmed him unexpectedly. "I'd like that very much." That evening marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, Delia continued to visit, though her role gradually shifted from helper to friend. They established a routine. She would arrive mid-morning, they would work together on chores, Delia insisting on learning about ranch work, and then often share the evening meal before she returned to her small house in town. As June turned to July, Frank found himself watching for her arrival each day, Sarah perched on his hip as they stood on the porch. The baby had grown attached to Delia, reaching for her eagerly whenever she appeared. "She loves you," Frank observed one evening as Delia rocked Sarah to sleep, humming the hymn that had become their nightly ritual. "The feeling is mutual," Delia replied softly, brushing a gentle kiss on Sarah's forehead. "She's a special child. You've been a blessing to us both," Frank said, the words coming more easily than he would have expected. "I don't know how to repay you." Delia looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. "Friendship isn't about repayment, Frank." The word friendship felt insufficient for what had grown between them, but Frank didn't know how to express the confusing emotions that had begun to stir in his heart. Instead, he simply nodded and added another log to the fire. As summer progressed, the friendship between Frank and Delia deepened. She taught him to sing lullabies for Sarah, laughing at his off-key attempts but encouraging him nonetheless. He taught her to ride properly Western style, steadying her with his hands on her waist as she adjusted to the different balance. "You're a natural," he told her as she cantered confidently around the corral on his gentlest mare. "I had a good teacher," she replied, her cheeks flushed with exertion and pleasure. In August, the annual Riverside Harvest Festival approached. Frank hadn't planned to attend large gatherings, still felt overwhelming without Grace beside him, but Delia was helping organize the schoolchildren's performance. "You should come," she urged as they sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset. "Sarah would enjoy the music, and it would do you good to see more people than just me and the occasional supply merchant." Frank ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure I'm ready for everyone's pity." "Then come for me," Delia said quietly. "I'd like to see you there." The simple request, and the look in her eyes as she made it, decided him. "All right," he agreed. "For you and Sarah I'll come." The day of the festival dawned clear and bright. Frank dressed in his best shirt, polished his boots, and even trimmed his beard, which had grown somewhat wild over the summer. He dressed Sarah in the pretty gown Grace had sewn before her birth, a task that brought both pain and a strange sense of rightness. The town square was transformed with bunting and lanterns, stalls selling food and crafts lining the edges. Frank felt self-conscious as he arrived with Sarah, aware of the curious glances and sympathetic nods from townspeople who hadn't seen him since the funeral. Then Delia appeared, weaving through the crowd toward him, and everything else faded into the background. She wore a sky-blue dress he'd never seen before, her auburn hair arranged in a simple but elegant style that framed her face. She looked lovely, and the realization hit Frank with unexpected force. "You came!" she exclaimed, reaching for Sarah with practiced ease. "And don't you look beautiful, little one?" "So do you," Frank said before he could think better of it. Delia blushed, a becoming pink spreading across her cheeks. "Thank you. It's not often I have occasion to wear my good dress." The day passed in a blur of activity. The children's performance, a series of patriotic songs in honor of the nation's centennial, was charming despite several missed notes. The communal feast that followed was the most companionable meal Frank had shared since Grace's passing, with neighbors stopping by to talk, offering genuine conversation rather than just condolences. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit, and a small band began to play. Couples moved to the cleared area in the center of the square, dancing to familiar tunes. Frank watched them, a dull ache in his chest as he remembered dancing with Grace at this same festival the previous year. Delia sat beside him on a bench, Sarah sleeping against her shoulder. "You're thinking of her," she observed softly. Frank nodded. "Last year's festival. She loved to dance." Delia was silent for a moment. "It's hard, seeing others continue traditions you shared with someone you've lost." "You speak as if from experience," Frank noted. Delia's gaze turned distant. "My father and I used to read poetry aloud on Sunday evenings. After he died, I couldn't bear to open a book of verse for nearly a year." She shifted Sarah gently. "But eventually, I realized that continuing the tradition was a way to honor him, not betray him." Frank considered her words as the band started a slower tune. Without fully deciding to do so, he found himself standing and holding out his hand to Delia. "Would you dance with me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something deeper. "What about Sarah?" Frank glanced around and spotted Mrs. Peterson, who had been particularly kind following Grace's death. "Mrs. Peterson," he called softly, "would you mind holding my daughter for a dance or two?" The older woman smiled warmly. "With pleasure, Mr. Turner." She took the sleeping Sarah, cradling her with the expertise of a woman who had raised 5 children of her own. Frank turned back to Delia, his hand still extended. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her smaller hand in his and allowed him to lead her to the dance area. As they moved together to the music, Frank was acutely aware of Delia's proximity, of the light floral scent of her hair, of the way her hand felt in his. It had been months since he'd touched anyone besides Sarah, and the contact was both alarming and comforting. "I haven't danced in years," Delia admitted, looking up at him with a smile that made his breath catch. "You dance beautifully," he replied, meaning it. She moved with natural grace, following his lead as if they had danced together many times before. "So do you," she said. "Though I admit I'm surprised you know how." Frank smiled slightly. "Grace insisted I learn before we attended our first social in Riverside. She said a man who could break a wild horse could certainly master a simple waltz." The mention of Grace no longer brought only pain. There was sorrow, yes, but also a warm remembrance that felt right. They danced through 3 songs before retrieving Sarah, who was beginning to stir in Mrs. Peterson's arms. As they walked together toward the edge of town where Frank had left his wagon, an unexpected contentment settled over him. "Thank you for convincing me to come today," he said as they reached the wagon. "You were right, it was good for both Sarah and me." Delia smiled up at him, the lantern light casting a warm glow on her face. "I'm glad, Frank." Acting on impulse, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Delia." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Good night, Frank," she whispered. The drive home that night, under a vast canopy of stars, Frank felt something unfamiliar stirring in his heart, hope, fragile but persistent. As summer gave way to autumn, the relationship between Frank and Delia continued to deepen. She still visited almost daily, despite school resuming, arriving in the afternoons with stories of her students' antics that made Frank laugh for the first time in months. One crisp October afternoon, Frank was splitting wood when he saw Delia approaching on horseback, earlier than usual. As she drew closer, he could see she was upset, her normally composed face tense with worry. "What's wrong?" he asked as she dismounted. "I've received a telegram," she said, pulling a paper from her pocket. My brother is ill typhoid fever. His wife asked that I return to Ohio immediately. Frank felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. When would you leave? Tomorrow's train, Delia said, her voice tight with restrained emotion. I don't know how long I'll be gone. Weeks, perhaps months, depending on his recovery. The thought of her absence created a hollow feeling in Frank's chest that surprised him with its intensity. Sarah will miss you terribly, he said, unable to express that he would miss her even more. Delia's eyes filled with tears. I'll miss her too. And you, Frank? They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken feelings between them. May I see her before I go? Delia asked finally. Frank nodded, leading her to the cabin where Sarah was napping. As Delia bent over the cradle, speaking softly to the now awake baby, Frank watched them together and suddenly understood the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. He loved her. The realization should have frightened him. It had been less than 6 months since Grace's death, but instead, it filled him with a calm certainty. Grace had been his first love, the mother of his child, a piece of his heart that would always belong to her. But Delia had brought light back into his life when he thought it extinguished forever. That evening, after Sarah was asleep, Frank and Delia sat before the fire, the impending separation lending a poignancy to their conversation. I don't know how to thank you, Frank said, breaking a lengthy silence. For everything you've done for us. Delia shook her head. I told you before, friendship isn't about repayment. And if it's more than friendship? The words escaped before Frank could reconsider them. Delia's gaze snapped to his, her eyes wide with surprise. Frank, I know it's too soon, he interrupted. I know that. And I know I have no right to ask you to wait, to see if what's growing between us might become something more. But I find myself wanting to ask anyway. Delia's expression softened. Frank, I care for you deeply. For both you and Sarah. But you're right, it is soon. Too soon for either of us to make promises. Frank nodded, accepting her gentle wisdom. Then I won't ask for promises. But I will ask you to write if you can. And to know that you'll be welcomed back, whenever you return. I will write, Delia assured him, reaching across to take his hand. And Frank? I'm not saying no. I'm just saying not yet. The small flame of hope in his heart burned a little brighter at her words. The following morning, Frank drove Delia to the train station in Riverside. The platform was crowded with morning travelers, creating a bubble of privacy around their farewell. Remember what I taught you about singing to Sarah, Delia said, her attempt at practical advice undermined by the tremor in her voice. And make sure to read to her every day, even if it's just from the newspaper. I will, Frank promised. We'll be fine, Delia. But we'll miss you. The train whistle blew, signaling the final boarding call. Delia knelt to kiss Sarah's forehead one last time, then straightened to face Frank. Without hesitation, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her close for a brief, precious moment. Come back to us, he whispered against her hair. I will, she promised, her voice thick with emotion. Take care of each other until then. As the train pulled away, Frank stood on the platform with Sarah in his arms, watching until it disappeared into the distance. The weeks that followed were difficult, but different from the crushing grief that had followed Grace's death. This separation held the promise of reunion, and Delia's letters arriving every week with remarkable regularity sustained both Frank and Sarah through the long autumn days. She wrote of her brother's slow recovery, of her nieces and nephews, of the Ohio autumn so different from Montana's. Between the lines, Frank could read her longing for return, matching his own desire to see her again. November brought the first heavy snows, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Frank found himself watching the road to town each day, knowing it was too soon for Delia's return but hoping nonetheless. Her letters spoke of Christmas preparations in Ohio, of her brother's improving health, of her hope to return soon if weather permits. Frank began his own preparations, cutting a small pine to place in the cabin window, crafting a simple wooden horse for Sarah's first Christmas, and most surprisingly to himself writing a letter to the jeweler in Helena, ordering a modest ring with a small sapphire that reminded him of Delia's favorite dress. December brought more snow and a painful silence from Ohio. 2 weeks passed without a letter, then 3. Frank tried to quell his growing worry, telling himself that winter weather often delayed mail service, but the concern gnawed at him constantly. On Christmas Eve, Frank sat before the fire with Sarah on his lap, reading to her from a book of children's tales Delia had left behind. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, driving snow against the windows. "Your mama loved Christmas," Frank told Sarah, who watched him with solemn blue eyes. "And I think Miss Delia does too. Maybe next Christmas, we'll all celebrate together." A sound outside caught his attention, the unmistakable crunch of horses' hooves in snow. Frank rose quickly, placing Sarah in her cradle. Visitors were rare in such weather, and night visitors even rarer. He opened the door, lantern raised, to find a snow-covered figure dismounting from a tired horse. "Hello, Frank," said a familiar voice, and then Delia was stepping into the light, her face reddened from cold but her eyes warm with happiness. "Delia," he breathed, scarcely believing she was real. "You're here." "I am," she confirmed, stamping snow from her boots. "My brother is recovered, and I couldn't bear to spend Christmas away from—" She hesitated, then finished softly, "away from home." Frank drew her inside, taking her coat and warming her hands between his. "Sarah's just about to sleep," he said, "but she'll want to see you." Delia moved to the cradle, where Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. The baby reached up, a delighted smile spreading across her tiny face. "Hello, sweet girl," Delia said, lifting her gently. "I've missed you so." As Sarah cuddled against Delia's shoulder, Frank felt his heart expand with love for both of them. This was what he wanted, what he needed. The three of them, together. "I have something to ask you," he said quietly. "Something I've been thinking about since you left." Delia looked up, her expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Frank, I love you," he said simply. "I didn't expect to love again so soon, or perhaps ever. But you brought light back into our lives when there was only darkness. You taught me that my heart could hold both grief for Grace and love for you, without diminishing either." He took Sarah from her arms, placing the drowsy baby back in her cradle, then knelt before Delia, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking you to replace Grace," he continued. "No one could. But I'm asking if you might consider building a new life with me and Sarah, a life that honors the past but looks toward the future. Our future together." Tears shone in Delia's eyes. "Are you certain?" "It's been less than a year since I'm certain," Frank interrupted gently. "Some people search a lifetime for what we found. I won't let convention tell me it's too soon to recognize that." Delia smiled through her tears. "Then yes, Frank Turner. I would be honored to build a life with you and Sarah." Frank rose, drawing her into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of the love they would share in the years to come. Later that night, after they had talked for hours by the fire, sharing all that had happened during their separation, Sarah awoke crying. Without hesitation, Delia lifted her from the cradle and began to hum the familiar hymn that had first soothed the infant months before. Frank joined her, his deep voice blending with her clear tones as they sang together, their voices weaving a harmony as natural as their love. Sarah's eyes grew heavy, and soon both she and Delia were asleep in the rocking chair by the fire. Frank watched them, these two people who had become his world, and sent a silent thanks to Grace for the love she had taught him to give, and to Delia for teaching him to love again. Outside, the Christmas snow fell softly, covering the Montana prairie in a blanket of white promise, while inside the small cabin, a family found peace in each other's arms.